Alright, so in this video we're going to create the login page for our app, which is going to be pretty minimal because we're going to use anonymous logins for this app just to see how we can, and because we don't need to get the user's information for what we need. So all we're going to have on our sign up page is the Uber logo and then a switch for a rider and a driver. So the user can choose which one they want to be and then click get started. So as we're using the enable automatic user, we shouldn't need to create a user manually, definitely not from their email address or username or anything like that. But what you will need to do is when the button is tapped, add a detail for that user on pass to save whether they selected to be a rider or a driver. The last thing I want you to add is a redirect to check whether the user, when they run the app, is already selected to be either a rider or a driver. And if so, for the moment, just put something in the logs, and then in the next video, we'll add the other activities and start doing the actual redirects as well. One final thing is that you'll notice I've got rid of the action bar there. We've done that programmatically using code, and that's just a small Google away from your current knowledge. You should be able to figure that out. But as always, feel free to watch me go through the process if you'd rather. Hope you're going to give it a shot though. Best of luck. Alright, hope that went well. I'm going to start by just removing this test code from last time and replacing the action bar activity with app compat activity so that we're not using any deprecated methods. There we go. Then I'm going to move over to activity main and start creating our login and sign up page. So I'll start by just deleting the text view. And then I'm going to add in an image, which is just going to be the Uber logo. So let's just do a quick image search to get that. Once again, obviously, if you're making your own app, don't use the logo of another company, but it'll do fine for our purposes here. So I'm just going to control click or right click and save image as, and then just pop it there on the desktop. All right, so now go back into Android Studio, and within resources, we'll create a new directory, which is going to be drawable. Refresh that, and then we'll open up drawable again with a right click or control click and reveal it in the Finder so that we can drag our image into it. Whoop, there we go. And just before we drag it in, I'm going to quickly resize it just to make sure it's not too big. So again, I'm using preview just by double clicking on it and then tools, adjust size. So 4000 pixels is pretty big, a lot bigger than we need anyway. 500 pixels should do fine. And it will stop us having any memory problems on the simulator as well. If you're in Windows, you'll need to find your own image resizing program. There are many free ones out there. So now I've just dragged Uber logo into drawable. And it should, there we go, appear there. Fantastic. Remember, you can use control click and then synchronize if it doesn't appear there. Okay, now let's bring in our image view. So I want to center it and align it to the top of our relative layout. Then I'm going to scroll down to the source and click the button to select our image. It's right at the bottom there. Uber logo. Fantastic. That actually looks pretty perfect as is. But we do need to change the background color of our relative layout as we did before to white, which is selected by default there, so that doesn't look too weird. All right. Now remember, we're using anonymous users here, so we don't actually need to collect the user's username or password or email address or anything like that. The only bit of information that we need about them is whether they want to be a rider or a driver. So I'm going to use a switch for that. So I'm going to drag in my switch again. I'm going to center it, but I want it to be below the image view. So there we go. So our switch is usually an on or off, but you can use it for a 2-choice setup as well. We do have an error here. If you have a look, so to use a switch we need an API level of 14 and the current minimum is 9. So 9 is the default minimum API level on the past starter project that we're using. I'm happy to upgrade that to 14, which is pretty old anyway. So what I'm going to do is go into Gradle scripts. We haven't looked into Gradle scripts before, but these are the scripts that actually build your app when you press the play button. And some of them contain some useful settings that we can change. And I think the one that we want is just that top one there. Yep, there you go. So you can see we've got a few options there. You can mostly just about work out what some of those do maybe. But the key one that we need here is this min SDK version. So if we just change that to 14, and then whenever you change anything in the Gradle scripts, you need to do a resync, and it will then rebuild the project, and that should get rid of that nasty error. As we're using API level 21, it's not actually going to be a problem for us anyway, but we don't like to have those nasty red circles everywhere. Okay, so now I'm happy with this switch, but if I try and add a label there, or a plain old text view, so let's say if I want to align it to the right of the switch, then it's difficult to get this text and the new label text to match up and be the same position, style, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get rid of the text on new switch so that there's no text at all, and I'll call this rider or driver switch, and we'll update any references to that. So now it's just a switch. So now I can be a bit more detailed with what I do to this and then just create a new text view on the other side, and they should match up nicely. So new text, I want to say driver. I don't really care about the ID because we're not going to be doing anything with that. And then I'm going to make the text size a little bit bigger. So let's try 20 SP. That looks pretty good to me. I want to also make it a little bit darker. So I'm going to go to text color, and I'll just go straight into here and go for something pretty dark. Always go for off black. I think it looks a little bit nicer. I think I might go for something very slightly bigger. Click in there again, just so it's centered vertically without having to add any margins or anything. Maybe even slightly bigger than that. Okay, I like that. And then I'm going to add a little bit of a margin to the left side. Let's try just 10 dp. There we go. So I like that layout. I think that looks good. Obviously, if you're a better designer than me, that you probably are, then feel free to make that a lot prettier than I'm making it, but we're just having a basic layout set up here. So now I want to create another text view on the other side of the switch. So I'm just going to copy all of that. I'll just call it text view 2. The text is going to be rider, and this time we want it to the left of the switch, and we also want it to the start of the switch, and the margin this time is going to be on the right rather than the left. Okay, let's take a look, see if that looks good. Yep, I'm very happy with that layout. I think that looks great. Again, in a production app, you'd probably want it to have some kind of explanation as to what's going on here, but that's just a simple text view there, so I'll leave that for you to add if you want to. So rider or driver, and then we just need a button to sign up. So I'll make that below, I'd rather make it below the switch really, ideally. seems to be opting for the text view there. It doesn't really matter, but it's that switch that things are generally reliant on. So I'm actually going to change the ID that it's below to rider or driver switch. There we go. And I'm going to give it a top margin, let's say 20 dp, to move it down a little. Okay. And for the text, we'll have get started. And I'll call it get started. Okay, so I'm happy with that. We could maybe do with spreading it out a little bit more. So let's just add some margins in there. So I've got a margin top of 20 dps for the button. So let's change that to 40 dp, and let's also add in a similar margin top to the text views and the switch. And let's see what it looks like if we move the actual logo down as well. So let's just try that. There we go. Yep, I prefer that. I think it's a bit more spread out. Uses the space better. All right. And one final thing that relates to the layout is I want to get rid of the action bar for this login page. There's no need for it, and it just messes up my nice, neat, clean style, really. So I'm going to do that over in the main activity.java. And as that's something we haven't done before, let's do a quick Google and see if we can figure out how to do it. So I'll go for something like Android Java remove action bar. So that's how to disable the action bar permanently. That's not quite what we want. We only want it for the one activity. How to hide action bar on certain activities. That looks promising. So we've got some options in the manifest there. That's not great. I really want to do it in code. Here we go. This looks much better. So we're getting the action bar and then we're hiding it. That makes sense. So let's try and copy this code in here. We can update the indenting. So it did say it's either action bar or get support action bar. Action bar doesn't seem to be working for us, so let's try get support action bar, and we'll import that. Okay, seems to work fine. In fact, I think this action bar variable is a little bit unnecessary. We're not going to be using it again, so I'm just going to use get support action bar and then hide directly. Okay, so let's have a quick run of that just to make sure that that new code that we've added in particular works and that our layout all looks as good as we think it does. And just a reminder, we're going to be using maps, so make sure you run it on an emulator with API 21 and Google Play devices, Google Play installed. Otherwise, you'll have problems when we come to the maps part later on. If you're not sure how to do that, then go back to where we introduce maps and just follow that video along, and that will show you how to choose the correct type of emulator. And here we go. That looks great. You can see the action bar is gone, and we can choose both of those. That's great. I think the rider and driver are slightly too low down for my liking. So I don't usually spend a lot of time messing around with getting things exactly right here, but I will just slightly change the margin tops, just very slightly, to move them a little bit up. There you go. Okay, so now we want to allow the user to sign up. So let's add an on-click method to our Get Started button. Here we go. We'll call it Get Started. And then let's write the code for that. So we'll set up our method in the usual way. It's going to be called by a view, which we'll call view. That view is the button that we don't really care about, but we need to be ready to receive it either way. Okay, so we're going to need to be able to get the value of this switch. Now that's something that we haven't done before. So again, let's have a quick Google. So let's try Android, how to get value of switch. Simple as that. How do I correctly get the value from a switch? That looks promising. Okay, we don't need to worry too much about listeners because we've got our method set up anyway. But to me, this is checked. That looks like the method that we need. Is checked sounds like it will give us a kind of true false value depending on whether it's to the right or to the left. So let's try that. We're going to need to be able to access our button. So let's create a button variable called rider or driver button. I'm creating it up there, of course, so that I can access it both in onCreate and in getStarted. And in the onCreate method, I'll add it here. So rider or driver button is equal to a button, and we'll find it by its ID, r.id.rider or driver switch. Yes, sorry, it is actually a switch rather than a button. So let's use our naming correctly. That's better. And of course, we'll need to change those to switches as well. That's better. So now we can use an if statement to see if the switch is to the left or to the right. We can do that using if rider or driver switch dot, and then, oh there, it's predicted it for us, but it is checked. So that's when the switch is on. See if we can get it to predict that nicely for us. There we go. So if the switch is on, that means we want to set the user to be a driver, because on means to the right, so that's a driver. So I think the simplest way to do that is just to create a simple string, which I'll call rider or driver. And what we'll do is initially set it to rider, and then if the switch is checked, then we'll change it to driver. There we go. So now we want to assign the user to have a rider or driver property. Now, as we've discussed before, we're using pass user.enable automatic user. Now, I've found, however, this is not entirely reliable, at least in the simulator. We've already run the app here, but I'm not having a user created. So we don't have this automatic user. So I think we should start by doing a check to see if there is an automatic user, and if not, then create one. So again, that's something we haven't done before. So let's search for pass Android, create anonymous user. There we go. It's taking us to the Android Developers Guide in pass. If you haven't been here before, then the answer to many of your questions will be on this page. So we've got all the basic information that we already know about objects, and a lot more as well. So let's use Command F or Control F on Windows to search for anonymous. Here we go. So this is how we create an anonymous user. So let's copy that code, and we'll do this in the onCreate method. But only if the user's not already logged in. So we check that using if pass user.get current user is equal to null, and if that's the case, then we'll log the user in. Okay, So now we should have a user. I'm just going to run that while we're writing our code here, and we'll check when it's running to make sure that we do have our user on pass. And then what we want to do here is update our user to save the information of whether they're a rider or a driver. So let's use pass user dot get current user dot put, and then I'll call this rider or driver, and we want to save the variable rider or driver. So that's either going to be rider or driver depending on what they've selected with the switch. Okay, I think that's run now, so let's just have a quick check, make sure that we have our user, and there we go, there's our new user. Wonderful. So now we can update this user with the rider or driver information, and we've already done that locally. We need to do that on pass. So we do that in the same way that we would save an object. So pass user.get current user, and then save in background. And then we'll have a new save callback. We'll have a quick check for an exception, or specifically the lack of an exception. And we'll just use here, we might as well use the same log that we used there. So my app. And we'll have rider or driver signed up. And I think we need to make rider or driver a global variable to be able to view it there. It's not that important that we know it at this point, so we'll just change that to user rather than moving rider or driver outside of the method there. Okay, and that of course is where we would redirect them to one of the login areas, depending on which one they've chosen. All right, so let's just give this a try. So we should now be able to choose either rider or driver, and that will save to pass. So I'm just going to go for rider. So user signed up, that looks promising. And then let's just do a quick refresh here. We should now have a new field, rider or driver, with rider in it. There we go. Wonderful. And you'll notice as well that users by default have a public read ACL. That's going to be useful because we're going to need to view the location of our users later on. So if that wasn't the case, we would need to set that manually, but we don't because it is. Okay. Right. So the last thing then from the sign up portion of the app is that we want to do a check when the app is opened to see if the user has already selected whether they're a rider or a driver, and if so, then we'll redirect them to the appropriate activity within the app. So we can do that fairly easily. So actually we could do it in an else statement here. So if we have a user, it's worth just checking to make sure that if pass user dot get current user dot get, and then we want to get the rider or driver variable, and we just want to see if that's not equal to null, and then for now we'll just log my app redirect user. Okay, so now if we run that, we should get redirect user because we've already decided to be a rider. And then at the beginning of the next video, we'll actually create the other activities and do the redirects depending on whether or not our user has already logged in. And I think you may have just seen it there. There it is, redirect user. Wonderful. So that's great. That's as far as we're planning to get on this particular video. In the next one, we'll start adding the different activities, particularly focusing on the rider activity. See you there.